The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisperer in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am talking about the Wages of Sin. That's right, FFG released a preview for the second Mythos pack in the Circle Undone cycle. Almost every Mythos pack released for the Arkham Horror LCG thus far has featured some tweak or innovation to keep the game fresh, and Wages of Sin is no exception. Let's talk briefly about the plot of Wages of Sin. After confronting Keziah Mason and Brown Jenkin in the Witch House on French Hill, the investigators hear reports of ghost sightings and strange activity in the woods at Hangman's Hill. Now, try as I might, I couldn't find much in the way of information about Hangman's Hill, other than it's Arkham's old graveyard, so no real surprise there. Anyway, desperate to learn more information about Arkham's history of witchcraft and persecution, the investigators head to Hangman's Hill, where they discover witches are haunting the area in pursuit of some unholy purpose. Now, Fantasy Flight's preview article spoils Agenda 1A and Act 1A, which really don't tell us all that much about what to expect in this scenario. Agenda 1A, the Hanged Man 12, has a doom threshold of 8, which is among the longer doom thresholds in the game. That seems to suggest the investigators will have time on their side while they explore the environs of Hangman's Hill. However, I really wouldn't be that surprised if Ancient Evils, that encounter set, figures prominently in the Wages of Sin encounter deck. Ancient Evils or some other card that adds Doom to the agenda or cards in play would certainly speed up the scenario, significantly giving the investigators much less time to explore Hangman's Hill. Act 1A, In Pursuit of the Dead, reminds us that we've come to Hangman's Hill to investigate ghost sightings and strange activity in the woods and learn more about the witches who once hid in Arkham. While the act is in play, locations cannot be flipped over, more on that in a moment, and investigators will need to spend 3 clues per investigator to advance. Now, flipping locations has been fundamental to the Arkham Horror LCG since the core set. Everybody is familiar with moving to a location and flipping it over to reveal what's on the back, but that takes on a new twist in the Wages of Sin. The ghosts that haunt the graveyard on Hangman's Hill exist on a separate plane from the investigators, and that is represented by the scenario's locations, which have 2 revealed sides. One of the revealed sides is the normal, which you would expect in any scenario, and on the other side it has the Spectral trait to identify that it is on a separate plane. Now, the preview article does supply one example of this type of location, the Abandoned Chapel. On the front side, Abandoned Chapel is a 2-shroud location with 2 clues per investigator. It has the game text, during the Mythos phase, each investigator in Abandoned Chapel gets -1 to each skill. It's also worth a victory point. The Abandoned Chapel is the whippoorwill of locations, and I'm going to call it right now that I am almost guaranteed to forget to trigger that effect time and again, just like I forgot to trigger the whippoorwills even though they were sitting there staring me in the face. I'm hoping that by calling out my error now, I may be able to prevent it in the future when I sit down to play this scenario. Now, it's interesting to note here that the Abandoned Chapel is connected to 4 other locations, so we know based on that there are at least 5 locations on Hangman's Hill. That's good news for players who enjoy playing evasion-based decks after the small and cramped maps that were featured in some of the Forgotten Age scenarios. Now, it's not clear from the preview whether all of the locations will start the game in play or whether there'll be a few set aside at the start of the game and then enter play later. I could certainly see a location like the Abandoned Chapel be something that maybe be on the table. And then the preview article mentions a couple of other locations that are attached to the Abandoned Chapel, and I could see maybe those coming into play at a later date. But We won't know that until we get our hands on the scenario. Now, if you manage to flip the Abandoned Chapel, which can't happen until you have advanced Act 1A, it looks like. We don't know if there are any other requirements for flipping a location. You will find yourself on a separate plane. This version of Abandoned Chapel is a 2-shroud location that has no clues, and it has the Spectral trait, which we'll discuss in more detail in a moment, and the game text. During the Mythos phase, each investigator in Abandoned Chapel gets -1 to each skill. Now, there's not much difference with its other side. However, the card also features a new trigger, Haunted, which here means you get -1 to each skill until the end of the round. Now, the article does not discuss the Haunted trigger, so it's unclear whether it is a new trigger that is specific to the Wages of Sin, or whether it will make an appearance in other scenarios in the Circle Unbound, perhaps in the deluxe box itself. Now, I'm not sure how Haunted triggers, and I know I'm bound to forget it as well, since it's on a location card, and I seem to have a terrible time remembering those. But I would not be surprised if there are situations where the 2-1 modifiers stack, so you end up with -2 to each skill during the Mythos phase. That would be extremely nasty. You are much more likely to take 3 horror from a card like Rotting Remains if you are starting the skill test already at a -2 skill value before the pull. I'm not sure whether these types of skill modifiers are going to be common during the Circle Unbound cycle, but if they are, you'd probably do well to play an investigator with naturally high skill values such as Daisy Walker and Agnes Baker. They seem like safe bets to me. If you're starting off at 5 intellect or 5 willpower, that taking that -2 doesn't hurt quite as much. And we've already seen the preview in the Circle Unbound deluxe box for Diana Stanley, who is effectively, if you get enough cards down, she is a 6 willpower investigator, so that -2 would have less of an impact on an investigator like her. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the flip side of Abandoned Chapel has the Spectral trait, which keys into the scenario's other mechanic, which is multiple encounter decks. While your investigator is at a location with the Spectral trait, you draw cards from the Spectral encounter deck rather than the normal encounter deck. Cramming 2 encounter decks worth of cards into one Mythos pack seems pretty unlikely, so I expect quite a few of the cards in the Spectral encounter deck to be a mix of cards from the Circle Undone and the Wages of Sin. Or maybe they'll just do it so the standard encounter deck has Circle Undone cards, and then the Spectral encounter deck is made up mostly of the Wages of Sin. Fantasy Flight spoiled 2 of the encounter cards from the Spectral encounter deck, an enemy Malevolent Spirits and a Treachery Gravelight. Malevolent Spirit is an enemy with 2 fight, 2 health, and 2 evade, and it hits for 1 horror. It has the Monster Geist and Spectral traits, and it spawns at the Chapel Attic or Chapel Crypt. So there's 2 more locations that we know about. Presumably the Chapel Attic and Crypt are attached to the Abandoned Chapel. So we know 2 of the locations that the Abandoned Chapel is connected to. Now, while the Malevolent Spirit is at a Spectral location, it gains Hunter and gets +1 damage value and +1 horror value. It also has the following forced effect: when Malevolent Spirit is defeated by damage, except from a spell or a relic, instead of discarding it, heal all damage from it, exhaust it, and move it to any Spectral location if able. Now, the Malevolent Spirit isn't a particularly difficult enemy to deal with as a 2/2/2, but man, investigators had better start packing items such as the Enchanted Blade, which was spoiled in the Secret Name preview, if they want to take down this guy permanently. Having him with that ability just to exhaust and move back to a spectral location and heal is downright nasty. Otherwise, you're just going to have to fight him over and over again. Now, obviously, the Malevolent Spirit becomes much more powerful at a spectral location. However, its game text does have some interesting interactions. For example, if the Malevolent Spirit is at a Spectral location, it will gain Hunter as well as the bonus damage and Horror. And then during that the following enemy phase, it will move to a connecting location which may not have the Spectral trait. So the Malevolent Spirit would lose the Hunter keyword as well as the bonus damage and Horror. If no investigator happens to be at that location, the Malevolent Spirit will just get stuck there since it is no longer a hunter. Now, it all depends on how the locations, how this whole flipping mechanic works. And it kind of seems unlikely to me, but, you know, if the investigators might be able to get away from these spectral enemies if they can put a non-spectral location between them. But like I said, that all depends on the size of the map and the nature of the location flipping mechanic. And I have a feeling that those locations, once you advance from Act 1A, you're going to be flipping locations quite a lot. And these Malevolent Spirits are going to be able to hunt you down wherever you may go. Now, the second card was Gravelight. It's a Treachery with the Curse trait. Its effect depends on whether it's drawn from the Spectral encounter deck or the normal encounter deck. If you draw it from the standard encounter deck, you shuffle it into the Spectral encounter deck and it gains Surge. That's a pretty typical type of effect we've seen on many cards in the past. If you draw it from the Spectral encounter deck, you take 2 damage and place it in the standard encounter deck discard pile. Taking 2 damage without an opportunity to make a skill test is pretty mean, and I'd be willing to bet there's a Treachery that inflicts Horror in a similar manner. Now, it seems unlikely that you are going to draw Gravelight from the standard encounter deck if you're playing in solo, since solo players rarely need to reshuffle the standard encounter deck. It will have an impact, however, in multiplayer, where reshuffles are much more common. So if you're playing multiplayer, you will need to prepare to draw this thing from the standard encounter deck and surge into something else. Now, FFG's preview article also spoils 3 investigator cards. In fact, all 3 cards are allies. The first is Alice Luxley, Fearless Flatfoot. She's a 4-card Guardian asset with an intellect skill icon and the ally, detective, and police traits. While she is in play, your investigator gets +1 intellect. She also has the following response. After you discover a clue, exhaust Alice Luxley, deal 1 damage to an enemy at your location. She has 2 health, 2 sanity, and she takes up the ally slot. Now, my first impression of Alice is that she is a Roland card, although I might consider playing her in other solo Guardian builds for that intellect boost. That said, Alice's response lends itself to multiplayer much more than it does solo. I don't really see myself taking an attack of opportunity to discover a clue just so I can trigger Alice to deal damage to an enemy that is engaged with me. That doesn't seem like a very good deal at all. Now, you could deal damage to an exhausted enemy at your location, of course, but Guardians tend to really suck when it comes to evasion, so that seems unlikely to me, at least in solo. Now, in multiplayer, Alice enables Roland to kill an enemy at his location, trigger his response to discover a clue, and then trigger Alice to deal another damage to another enemy at his location. That's actually a pretty sweet ability. However, I don't think Guardians such as Zoe Samaras or Mark will have much interest in Alice in multiplayer, since they tend to focus almost exclusively on killing enemies rather than discovering clues. Of course, that +1 intellect bonus is nice, but those type of decks I think are really going to gravitate toward Beat Cop or Guard Dog over Alice. Now, the article also mentions that Leo Anderson is a possibility for Alice, but I really think that Leo prefers expendable non-unique allies just in case he can get Mitch Brown into play. And if he does get Mitch Brown down, he can have two additional non-unique allies into play, and Alice doesn't really help him with that. Now, I haven't played Carolyn Fern yet, so I'm a little bit hesitant to comment on her, but Alice actually looks pretty good in that deck. Carolyn has a 5 intellect with Alice in play, which is really good, and the ability to dish out a little bit of damage on the side is always appreciated, especially if you are playing in multiplayer and you've got a support investigator like Carolyn. If she can ping something, give the dedicated killers a bit of a helping hand. That's always nice. Now, when you look at the Guardian card pool, not many of the Guardian allies really lend themselves to Carolyn at the moment, so that makes Alice's stock go up. However, it's worth noting here that Carolyn can also take Seeker and Mystic allies, which means Dr. Malevolent Christopher is a possibility as long as there isn't a dedicated Seeker who wants him. You know, come to think of it, Roland can also take the good doctor, so it's not like Alice is a no-brainer. She does have some stiff competition for that ally slot, so you are going to have to weigh the benefits of that extra damage versus the extra resources that Dr. Malevolent Christopher can provide. Personally, I tend to think the resources are always good, while that extra damage is going to be a lot more situational, which sort of tips it in favor of Dr. Malevolent Christopher, but I mean, he is an amazing card, so pretty much any ally that's released is going to have a tough time dealing with him. It's interesting, you know, Alice's game text does mention you have to exhaust her, and I could certainly see if Dr. Malevolent Christopher was released today, he would also have to exhaust to trigger his ability. Now, the second card spoiled is Mr. Rook, Dealer in Secrets. He's a 3-cost Seeker asset with a Willpower skill icon and the Ally trait. He uses 3 secrets and has the following free triggered ability: exhaust Mr. Rook and spend 1 secret, search the top 3, 6, or 9 cards of your deck for any card and draw it. If at least 1 weakness is among the searched cards, draw 1 of them as well. Shuffle your deck. Mr. Rook has 2 health and 2 sanity and takes up the ally slot. Now, I think Mr. Rook is a fascinating card, and the more I think about him, the more I like him. He digs quite deep into your deck. He'll get you any card you want, and he's got 2 health and 2 sanity. So he can take a hit and keep on ticking. And you can use his ability at least 3 times, and potentially many more, if you're packing cards like Enraptured or Truth from Fiction. Now, Seekers have received several tutors over the years, but there's usually strings attached. Research Librarian can search your entire deck, but only for a tome. Dr. Ellie Horowitz can search the top 9 cards of your deck, but only for a relic. Of course, her bonus is that you can store that relic on her. And Level 0 No Stone Unturned searches the top 6, but it is a one-shot event that costs 2 resources. So for an extra resource, you can get yourself an ally who can search 3 times as often and soak a bunch of damage and horror to boot. That seems like a very good deal, in my opinion. Mr. Rook certainly seems ideal if you're playing some sort of complicated combo deck with a lot of moving parts, since he does give you 3 bites at the apple as free triggered abilities. If those were actions, I don't think they certainly wouldn't be nearly as good. But free triggered abilities, I'm all for that. So I was trying to think of decks where he could fit, and perhaps he could find a home in one of those Seeker decks that aims to barricade themselves in a location and then investigate everything from a distance. Those decks seem to have a lot of moving parts, including cards like Barricade and In the Know, and Mr. Rook would certainly help you assemble those pieces that much more quickly. Mr. Rook does have a drawback, however, in that he forces you to draw a weakness if it is among the searched cards. Now, the signature weaknesses for Seekers tend to be quite annoying, if not downright bad. I think the King in Yellow and Call of the Unknown both are incredibly punishing. That said, I'd argue Mr. Rook's downside is actually a positive in some ways. If I'm going to see a weakness during a scenario, I would much rather see it early than late. If I see it early, then I can deal with it before the shit really hits the fan. Imagine if you could time when you draw a weakness like Amnesia, Paranoia, or any of those weaknesses that tax your actions. You probably want to play Mr. Rook as early as possible to help you assemble the pieces of your combination, so it would make sense to drop him on the table, dump your hand or resources as necessary, and then fish out your weakness, which would then trigger almost harmlessly. I think that's a far better way for your weakness to show up rather than at the climax of a scenario when it would gut your hand or resources or force you to take 2 actions that you simply cannot spare. Now, it's also worth noting that drawing your weakness with Mr. Rook happens in addition to the card you fetch, so you're essentially drawing that weakness for free. How many times have you been going full steam ahead only to draw your weakness using an action or during the upkeep phase? Man, that just feels like a punch to the gut. You were hoping to get a card and keep that momentum going, and instead you just get nothing. In fact, you get worse than nothing because you now have a weakness to deal with. But if you can draw your weakness with Mr. Rook, you're going to mitigate that small tempo hit that you were going to take down the line anyway. Now, drawing a weakness sucks, don't get me wrong, but given the choice, I'd much rather draw it for free with Mr. Rook than waste an action or an upkeep phase drawing one. So I think if you're in the market for a tutor, I think Mr. Rook makes an awfully compelling case for himself. The final card that was spoiled in the article is Henry Wan, Inspiring Actor. Henry is a 3-cost rogue asset with an agility skill icon and the ally in criminal trait. He has the following game text: action, exhaust Henry Wan, 1 at a time, reveal random tokens from the Chaos Bag until you choose to stop, or until you reveal a Skull, Cultist, Tablet, Elder Thing, or Tentacle symbol. If you choose to stop, for each token revealed via this effect, you may either draw 1 card or gain 1 resource. If you revealed a Skull, Cultist, Tablet, Elder Thing, or Tentacle symbol, do nothing. Henry has 1 health, 2 sanity, and he takes up an ally slot. Now, gambling is at the heart of the rogue class, and Henry Wan captures that theme perfectly. He's got an interesting push your luck element going for him, and if you're playing in a scenario, say the Untamed Wilds, for example, you could theoretically draw 10 cards and or gain 10 resources with Henry, but the odds of that happening are so remote that it's really not worth discussing. So what are the odds when you're using Henry during a scenario such as the Untamed Wilds? Well, if you take an action to gain a card or resource, you will have a 100% chance of success. I mean, it's built into the game. If you trigger Henry, your odds of success are only 71.43%. So in effect, you're sacrificing some of that certainty if you just take an action to get that card or resource for a chance to really push your luck and gain even more cards and resources. Now, if I've done the math right, you've got a 49.45% chance of gaining 2 cards and or resources with Henry, and a 33% chance of gaining 3. As you can see by this chart, you've got a 21% chance of gaining 4 and a 12.6% chance of gaining 5. Now, as you can see, the odds of successfully pushing your luck are less than 50% on the second pull, and they drop off dramatically from there. And then, of course, there are the times when you pull a special token as the first token you reveal, and you get nothing, which would suck. Now, if you're really worried about drawing a bad token, you could play Henry with some sort of Chaos Bag manipulation. Wendy Adams immediately comes to mind, since she can take Henry as an ally. However, I'm not convinced that Wendy makes Henry that much better. If you trigger Wendy's ability, you have to discard a card from your hand to reveal another token at the same odds. Say you reveal a skull as your second token, you trigger Wendy's response to return the skull to the bag and reveal another token. You haven't changed the odds at all. You've still got less than 50% chance of successfully revealing 2 good tokens. If you draw one of the special tokens again, you're out a card and an action at this point, which I think you'll agree is a very bad deal. Now, I have seen some people on the forum suggesting combining Henry with cards that seal tokens to bend the odds in your favor. That is certainly a possibility, although I think it's important to remember that it will take a lot of time and or resources to set up that sort of combination. And honestly, I'm just not sure it's worth it, since all that time and resources could be better spent simply beating the scenario. I know there's some people who are gonna give it a shot, but I'm not convinced that that combination alone is going to win you a game. Now, of the rogues, Safina is, I believe, the only one who can pull all of the, who can use that seal tech. If you wanted to try it in multiplayer, you'd need to combine the rogue with another mystic investigator who would have to help them with that seal tech. Again, I'm not sure whether I'd be building my deck, even if I knew if somebody had Henry in their deck. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be building specifically just so they could draw a lot of cards and gain a lot of resources. I mean, each deck has a role to play, and by committing all those cards and resources to doing that one thing, you're going to be taking away from some other element of the game. As you can probably guess, I'm not terribly excited about Henry. Sure, there are going to be those games where you get lucky and you gain 5 cards and or resources. However, if I've done the math right, if you reveal 2 tokens, you've got a 50-50 chance of gaining 2 cards and or resources, or gaining nothing. And your odds just drop off dramatically from there. If you can mitigate some of the variance by playing Henry in combination with Chaos Bag Manipulation or Seals, you might be able to pull off some, have a higher chance of pulling off some of those big plays. But that sort of combo is going to take time and energy to set up. And, frankly, I'd rather just play an ally like Leo DeLuca and gain an extra action every turn rather than mess around with that sort of elaborate combo. That's going to do it for my preview of The Wages of Sin. All in all, I like how this pack is shaping up. Between flipping locations to their Spectral side and 2 encounter decks, the scenario has plenty of cool tricks to pique my interest. We haven't really battled many ghosts or spirits besides the Poltergeist in the Path to Carcosa. So it's going to be very interesting to go toe-to-toe with a whole bunch of them, which could be disastrous if you don't have a spell or relic handy. And so far, I mean, the Mystics have all the spells, and there is that the one relic that was spoiled in the secret name, the Enchanted Blade. So perhaps we'll see 1 or 2 more spells or relics in the Circle Undone to give us a leg up when we shift planes. I would really dread facing a lot of, dealing with 1 Poltergeist was fine in Curtain Call. Dealing with a whole bunch of them, now that would be pretty terrifying. As for the Investigator cards, I can see Alice seeing play in Roland or Carolyn, and I do quite like Mr. Rook as well. Henry Wan seems pretty meh. I mean, you need to reveal 2 Chaos tokens to make him worth your while, and if you do reveal 2, it's going to pay off less than 50% of the time in a scenario such as the Untamed Wilds. Again, he might be good with the right Chaos Bag or some Chaos Bag Manipulation, but to be perfectly honest, I'm a little tired of Chaos Bag Manipulation at this point. There was so much of it in the Forgotten Age that it just feels like an awful lot of work to really accomplish very little. But don't take my word for it. The pack will be out in a couple months, and I would encourage you to go out, buy it, and sleeve these cards up and give them a shot and see how they work for you, because this is just one man from Lang's opinion. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.